So welcome everybody. So it's kind of a nice time of year. It's November 1st. November is Diabetes Awareness Month. We have World Diabetes Day that's coming up on November the 14th. And so with that in mind, I'm happy to be here talking about how we can help manage and prevent diabetes through diet and lifestyle changes. And so it is never too late to make changes, even if you've already been diagnosed with prediabetes, diabetes. If you have friends or family members, that are part of that huge group of us that have diabetes, never too late to make changes, especially nutritional changes, to start reversing that process and managing those blood sugars. So I wanted to start off just kind of talking briefly about what diabetes is inside of our bodies. So there are different variations of diabetes. It used to be, the thought was there was just the type 1 that we saw primarily in the younger population, where we had a destruction of those beta cells on the pancreas, and we didn't have insulin production. And that's how we had elevated blood sugars, as insulin wasn't doing its job and getting blood sugar out of the bloodstream and into the cells. And then we thought, okay, there's the type 1, but then there's also the type 2 that comes later in life where we're making insulin, but insulin, there's something in the way from insulin doing its job. And we call that insulin resistance. We're also finding now that in addition to type 1 and type 2, we also have kind of a 1.5, where there might be an autoimmune impact, where insulin isn't working well, but we also have some destruction to those beta cells in addition to insulin resistance. And so we want to make sure people are aware that there's a lot of different types of diabetes. There's also diabetes that occurs primarily during pregnancy. We call it gestational diabetes. And I was fortunate enough to have gestational diabetes. And it also is impacted by hormonal changes, but also that insulin resistance piece where insulin can't work as well because of hormones during pregnancy. So lots of different faces of diabetes, so to speak. And you don't have to tell me if you have diabetes, but maybe a show of hands if you're dealing with diabetes personally, or at least you know somebody closely that is. Okay. Great, thank you for sharing. And the statistics, they're scary, but the good news is over the last few years, we're actually seeing a drop in the rates of diabetes diagnoses, which is nice. Huge prevalence of prediabetes, but I'm fortunate that we're catching prediabetes in that prediabetic stage, and so we're preventing newer diagnoses of type 2 diabetes. Does not mean, though, that diabetes isn't very, very prevalent in the United States. It's a huge issue. It's affecting close to 1 in 4 people. And we're projecting, I think, by 2050, that's going to increase, significantly. So we know it's an issue, but we can address it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, primarily how we can address it through food. So I want to direct you to some of the handouts that were on the table over there as you walked in. One that we're going to be spending a lot of time on is our Daily Dozen worksheet. And I know some of you are probably familiar with this. This is a worksheet from Dr. Greger. He's a physician that's very passionate about nutrition research. These are some of his guidelines where we've taken a lot of the nutrition-based research and summarized it into 12 kind of health habits that we can impart daily to help manage not only diabetes and prediabetes, but the top diseases that are killing Americans today. And diabetes, unfortunately, is number 7. But heart disease is still number 1. So heart disease is still our number 1 killer of Americans. And because diabetes and heart disease go hand in hand, we really want to make sure that we're spending some time going over this Daily Dozen worksheet and giving you tools for how you can start consuming these foods daily, because it can be done, I promise you that. So as we go through this worksheet, what you'll find is there's several commonalities among these different foods, but one that's really important and that you'll see again and again is all these foods that are on this list are incredibly high in fiber. And if any of you have dealt with diabetes or a heart-healthy diet, hopefully somebody has encouraged you to eat more fibrous foods. Anybody? Okay. So that's a good thing. We want everybody eating more fiber, and we don't want it in the form of a supplement. So we're not talking, let's add a little Metamucil to a glass of water daily. We're talking whole food fiber. Like some of these, I have dried foods in front of me, but whole grains, nuts, seeds, and of course legumes, the bean family. By eating foods that have more fiber, we're helping prevent, we're helping reverse, and we're helping manage those top diseases that are affecting us. And so think of yourselves, think of your family members. If you're similar to most Americans, either yourself or somebody you know is probably dealing with prediabetes or diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, overweight or obesity, and maybe some form of cancer. Those are some of our top things we're dealing with here in the U.S. The good news is, even though we're focused on diabetes today, these same top 10 foods and top 12 health habits have huge positive impacts in terms of all of those different disease processes and kind of negative health outcomes that maybe you or some of your loved ones are dealing with. So that's something to keep in mind, is even though we're going to be talking a lot about blood sugars and diabetes management, huge benefits regardless of if your goal is to prevent a recurrence of breast cancer, or if your goal is to lose 5 pounds, or if your goal is to bring your cholesterol down. Same guidelines. So fiber is our magic bullet. And just to throw it out to everybody here, what's one food that comes to mind when you think of fiber? Beans, thank you. And Andy, I didn't pay her to say that. So beans are at the top of the list. And as we go through this list, you'll see we have our foods. Next to our foods, we have our recommended amount of servings per day. And I apologize, I don't have our presentation to go along with it to guide you through a little better. But you'll see the serving size for beans. We have 3 boxes or 3 servings. Each serving is about a half a cup of cooked beans or a quarter cup of hummus. So you can see, it may sound like a lot. You're going, a cup and a half of beans a day? How am I ever going to get that into our daily diet? We're going to walk you through several examples of how you can do just that. And hummus is an easy start. If you're not somebody that's a fan of beans or lentils, most people can spread a little hummus on a sandwich or dip some vegetables in it, and that's a good introduction to the legume family. Another way is sneaking beans. If you have family members that maybe are a little sensitive to beans, either don't like them texture-wise, flavor-wise. You can puree them and make sauces out of them. The white beans work really well that way. Or just sneaking them into a stir-fry, to a salad, to a soup, a stew, pasta meals. The white beans, black beans, garbanzo beans go really well into all of those dishes. And then, of course, we think of pinto beans when we think of traditional Mexican-style meals. If you're doing, a taco-style meal at home or a taco salad night, black beans, pinto beans go really well in those types of recipes. So we want to get creative with beans, even if we're starting with just the quarter cup of hummus. And the reason being, when we're speaking blood sugars for starters, the type of starch in beans does not convert to sugar like the type of starch in, say, pastas, breads, cereals, baked goods, and snack foods. And so we don't see that rise in blood sugars and the subsequent rise in insulin as we do from those other carbohydrate foods. And that's kind of what is one of the cornerstones of diabetes management, is choosing the healthiest forms of starches that don't give us that big blood sugar rise and fall after the meal. So beans, the key word is kind of resistant starch, is that fancy type of starch that beans have naturally that does not convert into sugar as it's broken down in the small intestine. The other benefit we get from that is as that starch moves through and makes it to our large intestine, it feeds our healthy bacteria. So it's a natural prebiotic that way, where it feeds the probiotics that are living in our gut that we want to flourish and thrive, to help our immunity, to help prevent a host of those health conditions that we're talking about. And beans can do all those things and more. So that's the short list of the health benefits of beans. So beans are definitely one. Yes, they're at the top of the list. There's a lot of ways that we can get, easy ways we can get beans in, and cheap ways that we can get beans in. So if you're concerned about, the cost of some of the packaged beans, the easiest and cheapest is buying your dried beans and soak overnight. And then it does take, over an hour to cook those beans. Pressure cooker, you can do it in about 20, 30 minutes. If that is too much for you, it is absolutely fine to go the canned route. We do want to make sure, though, that we're choosing organic, because usually the liner will be BPA free that way. Also, the organic, 9 times out of 10, are way lower in sodium. That's the one downside to the canned bean. There is some added salt. So peruse the label, look for the lowest sodium with your canned beans. Still drain and rinse them. You'll be able to get rid of an additional 50% roughly of the sodium by draining and rinsing. And then they can easily be incorporated, like we said, into meals or as a side dish or as a salad topper. There's also some fun bean snacks if you're looking for something just to grab and have a handful of. So I brought some of those to share. You'll find these in some of the grocery stores. Locally, some you have to search out online or at Trader Joe's and Whole Foods, but one brand is the Good Bean. These are real tasty, come in a variety of flavors. There's another brand called Enlightened. And no, I don't get any payment from talking about these brands. They're just ones I've tried and I enjoy. But these are ones that they're just a roasted, seasoned bean snack. And a good alternative if you're a savory snacker and you enjoy, say, chips or crackers or things like that in between meals. So are we feeling confident we can get beans into the diet daily? I hope, in some form. Okay. So next you'll see is our berries. And there's been a lot of media attention with berries, throwing flashy words like antioxidants and anthocyanins and polyphenols out there. And those are really powerful components. Those are the reasons why berries are phenomenal, not just for diabetes management, but disease prevention and management in general. And the goal here you'll see on the sheet is 1 serving daily. We can go above that, but at least 1 serving daily of a half a cup. And it can be frozen berries if that's easier. For a lot of people, it's easier and less expensive to purchase the frozen, mixed, or individual berries and then throw them into, say, an oatmeal. You can make a puree out of them and kind of, put it into a hot cereal, or if you have a treat on the weekends and you're making a homemade pancake, you kind of drizzle it on top. Or as a smoothie. This time of year, we don't always think of smoothies. It's a little cooler, but you can definitely incorporate them into a smoothie, or they're great just for nibbling and snacking at any time. Unfortunately not, but grapes are on our list as far as other fruits, because grapes, in addition to all of our other fruit family, we still reap huge health benefits. But they don't have that real high antioxidant property that berries have. And berries, specifically when we're talking about diabetes management, they're a little higher in fiber and lower in sugar, which makes them a real good option for people that are struggling to manage blood sugars and really enjoy fruit. Whereas grapes are, a little higher in sugar. And so we still absolutely can eat grapes when we're dealing with blood sugar concerns, but probably a little bit different amounts than the berries.
So strawberries, blackberries, raspberries.
Loganberries, yeah, anything in the berry family, absolutely. It is beneficial to have the seeds if we have kind of, just a puree or a jam or something of that matter. It's been processed, so we're losing some of the nutritional value. Oh, the dried are fine. You can get the freeze-dried, also a fun kind of salad topper. The canned, we just have to be cautious because a lot of times there's added sugar.
If you can them at home, but home canned is okay.
It is. If you're able to do it, yeah, with little to no added sugar, you're doing just kind of natural juice and then draining the juice.
And pressure cooker canning.
There you go. Yeah, we just have to be cautious when we're buying, a store-bought canned or processed food. That's where we really need to scour the label. Goji berries as well. My goodness, talk about, antioxidant powerhouses. Goji berries, unfortunately, they do kind of tip the financial scale. They are a little more expensive than your traditional berries, but I'd say any berry that you can find that's within your price point, if we can get a half a cup a day or at least most days of the week, huge health benefits there.
I asked because of the seeds because of diverticulitis.
Mm-hmm.
And the seeds are not.
And one thing, not to kind of go off onto the diverticulitis thing, but depending on where you're at with diverticulitis, If you haven't had a flare recently, a high fiber diet is a treatment for preventing a diverticulitis onset or recurrence, because fiber will kind of clean off, slough off, exactly. And so don't be afraid of seeds. If you're eating a high fiber diet consistently, we don't have to be as fearful of seeds when it comes to diverticular disease.
No way.
Yeah, if you are symptomatic, absolutely want to be avoiding seeds and those particulates.
Are the cranberries loaded with sugar, the dried ones that you can buy?
They are, unfortunately. It's hard to find, even at the health food stores. It can be very tricky to find dried, unsweetened cranberries. Yes. Yeah, any other guys in the berry family, definitely try to get in daily. If berries are challenging for you, we at least want to move down the list and do a plentiful amount of other whole fruits. You'll see dried fruit is on our list here as far as options for meeting our fruit quota daily. But when it comes to diabetes management, just as you were saying, dried fruit does tend to be sweetened, and it's more concentrated. You picture a whole bushel of apricots versus a handful of dried apricots. So it's the same amount of sugar. You're doing a handful versus a whole basket. And we're probably not going to eat the whole basket of whole apricots, but it's easy to snack away all that sugar from the dried. Dried fruits, though, definitely, chop them up real small, and it's another nice condiment. Sprinkle it onto a grain salad or into the hot cereal, or you can do a homemade trail mix with some nuts and that sprinkling of chopped dried fruit. So dried fruit is not the enemy. We just have to be a little more cautious with it when we're talking about blood sugar management. So berries and fruits, just to recap the health benefits, we didn't touch on cholesterol lowering. But remember that scary statistic, heart disease still number one killer of Americans, diabetes and heart disease closely linked. So fruits and vegetables, big amounts of fiber, soluble and insoluble, that literally help remove excess cholesterol from the body. It's this fascinating thing that happens as we consume these whole high fiber foods. As that food is moving through our duodenum, the little digestion and absorption zone, it literally says, "Hey, cholesterol, grab onto me." And then when it's time to get rid of our waste and we head to the restroom, the cholesterol comes out as well naturally. And so when I'm working with people who are adamantly against, cutting out high cholesterol foods from their diet, we set a new goal of, okay, when we're going to have the eggs or when we're going to have the little steak, we got to ramp up the high fiber foods with it. Let's have a side of beans. Let's have a plentiful amount of a salad or some roasted vegetables along with that higher cholesterol food, because it is true, as all that food is digesting together, we do remove some of that excess cholesterol. So that doesn't buy us, just eating liberally all the high cholesterol foods and just adding high fiber foods in, but it can be helpful. For people that are sticklers and they're not quite ready to reduce their intake of high cholesterol foods. So keep that in mind. But ideally, we're taking high cholesterol foods and replacing those with the high fiber, nutrient-dense foods that we're talking about tonight.
I don't see any eggs on this list.
Eggs, unfortunately, aren't on the list. And that's a good talking point. So eggs, they have zero fiber. And just an example as far as cholesterol, we're talking about cholesterol. One egg does have your entire daily allotment of cholesterol, about 200 milligrams. And so for that reason, if your body is a cholesterol-sensitive body, meaning your body naturally produces more cholesterol than what you can metabolize and handle, it is a good idea to be cautious about eggs as far as how often, how much. And then when you do have eggs, a great idea, throw the vegetables, do a scramble and throw in every vegetable you've got around inside of those eggs to help at least your body kind of clear out some of that cholesterol during digestion. Definitely. And that is where, we're kind of going off on a sidebar, but where Americans do tend to get into trouble. If we walk through the typical American diet, we call it the SAD diet, right? The standard American diet. If we walk through that diet, a lot of Americans are doing the bacon and egg style breakfast, maybe a slice of sourdough toast, zero fiber. We move into lunch and maybe we're doing a sandwich, or a lot of people are running through the drive-thru, say we're doing the burger and fries, zero fiber. maybe a minuscule amount if we're doing a slice of tomato and a lettuce leaf on the burger or the sandwich, but we're going through the day without any high fiber or nutrient dense foods. And then maybe we move into dinner and we do have, the side dish of vegetables. We have the starch, the meat, and the vegetable. But if the starch is, say, a mashed potato, we have our little vegetable, maybe it's the green beans, and then, we have our good portion of meat. The only significant fiber that entire day is that little amount of green beans. And so I encourage you, and maybe, take a peek at what your friends and family are doing too, non-judgmentally, and just say, you know what? Maybe I have a meal that is a zero fiber meal. And that's going to be the goal, is simply to start sneaking these foods into whatever that red flag meal may be. Not that starting tonight or tomorrow we're going to have to get all these daily dozen habits in place, but as we move through the days, the weeks, the months, are we making a shift and bringing in more high fiber and nutrient dense foods and cutting back on those higher cholesterol, high saturated fat, kind of inflammatory foods?
Are you saying that meat doesn't have any fiber?
Unfortunately not. So meat, eggs, dairy, zero fiber. Yes.
I think it does because it looks
I
like
love
less
hamburgers.
So yeah, you think of, that gristle. Well, isn't that fibrous material? Unfortunately, no, it's fat. So example there, I work with a lot of people that are doing meat, eggs, and dairy at every meal. And so we say, let's start with one meal. And maybe it's breakfast. Maybe we can make the transition from the eggs and bacon with the cheese on top of the eggs and just say, okay, if we're ready, we'll try the oatmeal bowl. Maybe every other day we're going to do the bowl of oatmeal. And I have a recipe I think most of you have called overnight oats. It's a simple recipe. It's a fun recipe. It's a tasty one. And that can be something, even if you're doing it every other day, that can still have an impact. And then we move on. Once you're going, I've got this. I can manage this. Then we move on to the next meal. And that's what it is. It's making these small changes over time to help heal our bodies and help prevent disease processes from happening. So we talked beans, we talked berries, we talked other fruits. Next, we're moving to the cruciferous vegetables. Cruciferous what? What is that? So cruciferous vegetables, I had one patient I was working with a couple weeks ago. He said, the little trees? Are you talking about the little trees? And so they do look like little trees. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. And we do want these in daily. And it's not a huge amount. We're talking half cup raw or 1 cup raw or half cup cooked. And, if you think of what that portion is, we can do this. This is a cup filled to the top. So if we're doing a cup of broccoli, we're exceeding our goal for cruciferous vegetables. Okay, so we're talking half a cup of cooked broccoli or 1 cup of, say it's a shredded cabbage that you're making a healthy slaw out of, or you're throwing into an entree salad. So we can do this. 1 cup really isn't that much. When we're eating ice cream, we go, oh, wow, I can eat a cup. But we think of a cup of beans or a cup of greens, and we get overwhelmed by it. But if we really look at what that cup is, we can do this. So the cruciferous vegetables, it's a very scientific process that happens in the body when we eat cruciferous vegetables, but there's these amazing sulfur compounds that we get from these cruciferous vegetables that have very powerful cancer-fighting properties. When it comes to diabetes, it goes back to that inflammatory process. The cruciferous vegetables are anti-inflammatory foods, as are your fruits, as are your berries. They're also high in fiber. They're also incredibly low in those carbohydrates we are talking about. So cruciferous vegetables, I've never worked with somebody who had an elevated blood sugar after a meal that was solely cruciferous vegetables. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So cruciferous vegetables, easy ways to sneak those into meals can be a healthy stir fry. It can be adding them in raw or cooked form, obviously, to a salad. Roasted vegetables this time of year are phenomenal. Is anyone a big roasted vegetable fan? Okay, so, and that's a quick one where if you have just a nice sheet pan, little parchment paper, throw your cut veggies on there. Olive oil is optional. You can spritz a little bit on and then load them up with whatever seasonings you enjoy, garlic, Italian seasoning, turmeric. Kind of toss them together and then in the oven, 400 degrees, 20, 30 minutes, And yeah, caramelization, yummy flavors, easy to get that half cup or more in when we're talking about cruciferous vegetables that way. So that can be, one that if you're trying to coerce other family members into veggies, they're thinking of just chomping on raw broccoli. It's not being that desirable, but roasted vegetables or the stir fry, or even, cutting them up in small pieces and putting them into a soup or the stews that we're talking about as well. Speaking of, this will be a good time to talk about this other recipe. And disclaimer, this is actually not one of Chef Kyle's recipes. It does say Roots Restaurant, but it's not one of Chef Kyle's. But this lentil artichoke stew, this is one that is kind of a heavy hitter because it has, per serving, close to 2 portions of your legumes from the lentils. If we revise the recipe a little bit and we put in some turmeric. We're hitting our turmeric and our spice goal that we'll find down on the list here. We have tomatoes and artichokes where we're getting another 1 to 2 portions of our vegetables. And then this or any other recipe, you could add in those cruciferous vegetables and or the greens, and all of a sudden we've hit almost half of our daily dozen list in one meal. So something to think about. And then we could sprinkle nuts or seeds on top. We could put our flaxseed on top. And then all of a sudden we're getting like a solely daily dozen meal right here. So something to experiment with at home, the lentil artichoke stew. So moving along, we talked about cruciferous vegetables, greens and other vegetables. So we were just talking about incorporating into this stew. Very similar health benefits as far as fiber, as far as low in calories, as far as very high in vitamins, minerals, the cholesterol lowering impact. Also big blood pressure lowering impact. We haven't talked about that yet. But how many of you are struggling to manage either your blood pressure or are close with somebody who is? I'm sure there's some of you. Okay, some of you. So blood pressure management. The nice thing about especially the greens, the other vegetables, the nuts as well, they're very rich in calcium, magnesium. And calcium and magnesium have a lot of benefits, but one big benefit is they relax our blood vessels. And so when our blood vessels are relaxed, blood can flow more freely. Blood pressure goes down. When we're consuming things like alcohol, caffeine, and high animal protein, high cholesterol foods, it tends to restrict the blood vessels. And, if you can kind of literally picture that blood vessel as it restricts and blood is trying to flow through, there's pressure, right? There's force against your artery walls and blood pressure goes up. And so sometimes if you're just thinking about that as you're eating, you're going, this is pretty amazing. I'm sitting here eating this beautiful salad. I'm feeling my vessels start to relax. My blood pressure is going down. But it does happen. All of the researchers that are doing the things behind the scenes that end up on these guidelines, they're seeing firsthand what happens as they're monitoring people's blood pressure and lipid levels in their blood and blood sugar levels before and after meals. And it's pretty phenomenal how quickly your body responds to healthy eating.
So it's calcium and magnesium. And then coffee and alcohol too raises blood pressure? They
do. So the caffeine, of course, we have that nervous system response that does restrict our blood vessels, unfortunately. And alcohol is one. My colleague Henrietta, she and I teach the diabetes classes. When she and I were talking about some of the research behind high blood pressure and alcohol, she was telling me they're still not quite sure physiologically that link between alcohol intake and high blood pressure. It's not as direct a link as we see, with caffeine or with sodium for that matter. But alcohol is definitely a risk factor for heart disease and for high blood pressure. So yes, we want to be doing greens and the other vegetables for blood pressure, blood cholesterol, blood sugar management.
Could you touch on any difference between cooked kale and raw kale?
Absolutely. So when it comes to any cooked versus raw fruit or vegetable, there are some differences. As far as the blood sugar world, we do break down the starches a little bit. With kale, there's not a big difference. You're not going to have an elevated blood sugar from cooked or raw kale. Nutritionally, though, I don't know the percentages, but as far as the abundance of nutrients, you do have some breakdown of nutrients, especially if you're boiling. I mean, you can see it firsthand. If you're boiling kale, you're going to see, unfortunately, some of the phytonutrients, the color, and the vitamins, minerals leach out into the water, and you lose those unless you're saving the cooking liquid and then drinking it after. And so that is some of the benefit of eating raw. When we are eating raw, though, some of the nutrients aren't as what we call bioavailable. And so if you do have digestive issues, it may be better to at least do a light steam or to kind of soft cook those nutrients to allow your body to better utilize them. And Doreen, I apologize. I don't have the difference as far as your nutrient bioavailability or your nutrient content with raw versus cooked greens. But there are some differences, and there are some people that are huge proponents of raw nutrition for that reason, because we're saving all of the nutrients. Nothing has been denatured, so to speak, or broken down. But as far as the diabetes prevention and management piece, disease prevention and management piece, if you're eating them raw or cooked, we want to, whatever form that you can eat them and you can eat them most frequently, that's how we would like them. And if it's easier for you to eat cooked vegetables, whether it's greens or something else, that's what we're going for. If raw is easier, that's what we're going for. Or kale chips. If it's kale chips that aren't heavily salted, we can go for those too. We're moving on to flax seeds next. My flax seeds spilled out all over my office floor, but I have some left here. And I'll pass them around if anyone wants to take a peek. I'm sure most of you are familiar with flax seeds because they are becoming, fortunately, pretty common these days. The reason flax seeds specifically are on this list, even separate from other nuts and seeds, is big health benefits along that whole spectrum of cancer, diabetes, cholesterol, heart disease management. And the blood pressure piece we were talking about, I hope I have my right statistic, but there's been at least one study, and I think it's been repeated, where we had a blood pressure reduction of about 9 millimeters of mercury. It doesn't sound like a lot, 9. But that can be a similar reduction that we see from prescription medications for blood pressure management. In just 1 tablespoon, the 1 tablespoon of ground flax daily, 1 tablespoon of ground flax daily. And so this isn't the flax oil capsules. This is the whole flax seed where we're getting all of those components, the fibrous material, the lignin, which is kind of like this neat phytoestrogen. And don't fear phytoestrogens, gentlemen. You'll only reap benefits from them, nothing negative. But the flaxseed, yes, we do want them ground, and we don't want the oil. We want the actual seed. If you're having trouble finding them in the stores pre-ground, which you shouldn't, because you can get them pretty readily around here, you can just put them in a coffee grinder. I've had a lot of people I talked to say, I bought my flaxseed, but they're whole seeds like the ones we're passing around right now. Just you can run them through a coffee grinder. If you have a real powerful blender, some blenders can also grind them up really well for you. And flaxseed, it is one that you can mix into just a glass of water, but you'll reap more benefits and absorb the nutrients better if you're sprinkling it and incorporating it into a meal. So it's a good mix-in. Again, into the hot cereal. We could keep talking about hot cereals, but it's a great mix-in into a hot cereal, a sprinkle onto a soup or a salad, or that smoothie if any of you are experimenting with smoothies at home. But flaxseed is on there for that reason. Lots of big benefits. And as far as the blood sugars that we're talking about tonight, that fibrous component of flax seeds, it does help kind of slow down and delay digestion. All fibrous foods do it, but that little amount of flaxseed can do that really well, so that you turn that meal into a time-release meal. That's that beautiful effect of eating high-fiber foods, including flaxseed, is that meal is then digested a little slower. That food is then released into the small intestine slower, and so you have a slower blood sugar response happening in the hours after that meal. And the nice thing about diabetes, and I can say this because I have diabetes, is you get that immediate result. And so you can have this meal, or you can try a new meal and check in an hour or two later and see immediately, wow, my blood sugar is different. A lot of people just start feeling different, but it's sometimes nice to have that confirmation that this change that you're making, whether it was a little change or a big change, that it is having an impact. And so I always remind the people that I work with that the one good thing about diabetes, you're getting that immediate feedback. And if your blood sugars did go a little higher than you wanted after the meal, that's just more feedback that maybe we need to make a change the next time we sit down and eat. So that is the nice thing, and that is what I encourage all of you to do if you are, or if your loved ones are checking blood sugars, is do a test, pick one of the new foods or the new meals that you're trying, check before and after that meal. And that gives you the best snapshot of how your body responded to that meal. So you're saying, okay, what did I go into that meal with as far as my blood sugars? What did I come out at? And if you didn't have a huge rise, we look for a rise usually about 30, 40 points depending on the individual. If you're somewhere in that range, we did good. That food worked well for you. Food worked really well. We usually look for about 30 to 50 points depending on the individual. Everybody's different as far as your medication, your activity level, and your meal plan requirements.
So not more than 30 to 50%.
Points. So as an example, say I'm getting ready to have breakfast in the morning. My blood sugar is at 95. If I come out a couple hours after that meal and my blood sugar is at 120, I'm doing pretty good. If I come out of that meal and my blood sugar is at 185, oh, okay, I need to go back to the drawing board and maybe revise that meal. So moving along here, we have our nuts. And I heard some of you, I was walking in talking about chia seeds. So nuts and seeds are in the same category here because they have very similar health benefits. And they are also rich in magnesium. We were talking about that beautiful effect of magnesium at relaxing blood vessels. The seeds specifically, and specific to chia seed, that soluble fiber effect. If you ever have put chia seed, just in water, you kind of see this neat science experiment that happens. It creates what Chef Kyle calls a raft. It creates kind of this little gel raft if you don't stir it. But if you stir that and incorporate that into a food, into a recipe, the kind of gel-like quality that you get from chia, it can act as a natural, I hate to say laxative, but a natural stool softener. If any of you are struggling with constipation or know people that are, it helps keep you hydrated because it keeps fluid in your body. It also has a huge host of nutrients and antioxidant power. So we were talking about the antioxidant power of the blueberries. Chia seed are right up there on the antioxidant scale. For that reason, chia seeds, because they don't oxidize, they don't break down when they get exposed to air and a little moisture, they can stay shelf stable for a really long time without you opening up your jar and going, oh geez, they've oxidized, they've gone bad.
I was just going to say that someone gifted me a cookbook. I don't think I would have gotten it if I had known that it was vegan, but it turns out it was vegan. And it had a recipe for basically like a mayo, using chia seeds. Yeah.
Huh,
And I tried it. It was like a chipotle mayo, but you're using chia seeds instead of.
That sounds great. I have not experimented with a chia spread or mayo. We've made in Ruth's restaurant and in our diabetes management classes the chia puddings. Might be a similar texture. So I don't know what the base of the mayo would be, but the base of the puddings, we usually use some type of a plant-based milk, an almond milk or a cashew milk. And then just stir the chia into it if you want a tapioca texture, or you can put it in a blender if you want more of a smoother texture to your pudding. And then it sits overnight, and you literally have a really yummy pudding that's very blood sugar friendly because it's so high in fiber, and is filling and really quite tasty. Good question. There is some natural flavor and sweetness from the almond milk or the plant milk. Even if you get an unsweetened, the vanilla almond milks have some good flavor, but you can use a touch of stevia. Or if we're talking outside the diabetes world, you can use a little bit of an agave. Chef Kyle does use a little bit of agave for some of his chia puddings. When I've made mine at home, I really enjoy chocolate. And so to counteract that bitter from the cocoa, I do put a little bit of stevia in it.
So stevia is okay for diabetics.
Stevia is, I always say with any sugar substitutes, and stevia technically is a sugar substitute, it's a naturally sourced one, which is great. But because they're so much sweeter than sugar, we need to be very, very cautious because our palates, our taste buds are very sensitive. And if we start incorporating these sugar alternatives into our meal plan daily, we're training our taste buds to kind of dull their reaction to sugar. The same thing happens with salt. And then all of a sudden, we're needing more of it to get that same, I hit my salt craving, or I took care of my sugar craving. And so that's kind of the only disclaimer, so to speak, with stevia, is it should be one of those sometimes foods, not an everyday ingredient. Definitely. Good questions.
Yes.
Because stevia tastes so sweet, does it stimulate insulin production?
No, not significantly. You do have to watch it though, because the processed stevia is like if you buy the stevia and the raw, the Truvia, you'll see when you read the ingredients that there's usually, the stevia, but then there's also maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is a starch, and so I have worked with some people that, they were getting to the point where they were literally kind of pouring, the stevia onto their breakfast cereal. And so they were getting this load of starch, which then did elevate blood sugars. So we do want to be cautious. And so make a teeny bit go a long way. You can purchase the liquid stevia drops. Even just stevia leaves. I haven't used just straight stevia leaves in cooking, but a lot of people incorporate them into teas for a natural sweetness. So just be cautious because they are so much sweeter than sugar. Have a little bit go a long way. And they can also have a little bitter aftertaste to some palates. And so you may find that with the stevia, but it can be a good recipe enhancer, so to speak, especially with the holidays coming, if you're trying to revise some of your holiday favorites and cut down on the sugar to incorporate a little stevia.
Before I forget it, I wanted to ask one question, and that is, somebody asked me in The End of Diabetes by Dr. Furman, in that book, there's some comment that he makes to because insulin resistance is more prevalent in the morning, to avoid grains and fruit for more weight loss gain.
So, and
is that true that there's more insulin resistance in the morning?
it is true. That part is true. What happens is overnight and into the early morning, we have a release of a lot of hormones. And hormones are a good thing. Growth hormone releases, as we're sleeping. We need that growth hormone. Some of our sex hormones have, various fluctuations overnight, our thyroid hormones. But anytime we have a surge of hormones counteract insulin, and then insulin can't work well. That's the insulin resistance piece. And so if you're one of those, that is finding that, oh man, I'm waking up and my blood sugars are elevated, it could be that hormonal cascade that's happening overnight. And if you're really struggling with after breakfast blood sugars being high, even when you're eating whole foods, that's when we may want to adjust that breakfast meal and really watch the type of starches we're taking in and maybe go lower on the natural sugars and do more of, say, a savory breakfast where we may do a tofu scramble where we've got a great tofu and a lot of vegetables scrambled together and a little avocado on top and see how that goes over. But it is true that we can, for a lot of individuals, have more insulin resistance in the morning and those overnight hours. Not necessarily, because if we have a healthy functioning pancreas genetically and otherwise, where your body's able to counteract that influx of hormones, we don't see a concern.
Is quinoa considered a grain?
It is. So yeah, quinoa is interesting. Technically, quinoa is a seed. So in terms of classification, it is a seed. In terms of our daily dozen, we see it as a grain, as a healthy starch. And so quinoa is one that you could incorporate into the morning breakfast cereal. But when we get down to whole grains, quinoa is one where that half cup would count as your grain portion. And similar to beans, but not quite as phenomenal as beans, because quinoa is higher in fiber and starch, that the starch quality that you get from quinoa won't result in as significant of a blood sugar rise as we see from rice, even wild rice and brown rice, and other starches, even like barley, couscous. I just have to say a side note about couscous. So couscous is not a health food. So couscous is still a highly processed grain. So be real cautious, especially if you're trying to manage blood sugars. And so we want to, kind of step away a little bit from couscous, from the rice, and lean towards getting the beans and the legumes in more often, bringing the quinoa in more often, and really ramping up the vegetables, definitely. So going back to our list, we were talking chia seeds, and chia seeds are just one seed, one example. But it can be as simple as just saying, you know what? Every afternoon when I get the munchies, I'm doing a little handful of nuts and a piece of fruit. And then I'm getting a serving of my fruit, a serving of my nuts, and reaping those benefits daily. And so it's finding those things that you can do routinely, at least 90+% of the time, to either manage a process that's already going on in your body or prevent a negative process from happening. I didn't mention nut butters, but the serving size for nut butters is 2 tablespoons. And you'll see on here it does recommend raw and unsalted. Best bet is if you head over to Mariposa. I think their machines are up and running. Okay, I heard they were down for a little while, but just grinding your own, and you've got just the nut to ground into your nut butter. You can find on the shelves, there are some organic nut butters that are just that. You look at the ingredients and it's just peanuts or it's just almonds. But when it comes to the one caveat with nuts and nut butters is they are calorically dense, meaning a lot of calories in a little package. So those of you that either yourselves or the loved ones that you're trying to get healthier, if you're trying to reduce your weight or manage your weight, we want to stick to these portions of the nuts and nut butters. A lot of times people, they're just eating the trail mix all day and the nuts all day, better than other snacks, other processed snacks, but then we wonder why, how come the weight's not coming down, or maybe the weight's trending up, and that's why it is a lot of calories in a little package. The right kind of calories, but just can be a little excessive.
So my husband actually, we buy like bags of almonds, and I think they are raw when we get them, but he toasts them to have for snacks. I mean, is the toasting altering them? I mean, they taste...
It's fine. Yeah, it's that... And it's that nitpicking. I love roasted almonds. All of my nuts, with the exception of walnuts, I always purchase roasted. I love the flavor. And yes, you are going to miss out on a small amount of nutrient quality, raw to roasted. You do lose some of those nutrients, but you're still going to reap as far as the health benefits. In the research studies, when they've looked at nuts or nut butters, it's not like they're using raw across the board, and if you eat anything but raw, you're not reaping benefits. So just so you know, nuts in almost any form, we're not talking the chocolate-covered, the sweetened nut mixes, but the honey roasted with the glaze and all the fancy things on it. So do watch that. Do watch the additions, read those labels, but if we can do that small handful or the little spread of the nut butter daily, we can reap benefits that way.
Not to talk too much about nuts, but what is the purpose of soaking them overnight?
So also that release, and I am not an expert here, but I believe it is that release of nutrients as it opens up and it softens. It does, I believe, kind of break down that ability for your body to utilize the nutrients. And I think that is that piece where some nuts do have, almost kind of a chemical that as it starts to sprout or pre-sprout, it's broken down. But like I said, I'm kind of speaking off the cuff here. I'm not an expert as far as sprouting or soaking or raw meal plans. Yeah, I have a friend of mine that's very into sprouting, and that's what she mentioned, is even if you're just soaking overnight, not even waiting until it technically sprouts, but that will take care of that concern.
You're talking about the beans now as well as the nuts, or only the nuts?
This is just the nuts we're talking about, but as far as the bioavailability of nutrients, the beauty of sprouted foods, whether you're sprouting broccoli seeds or you're sprouting beans, you do get, that larger amount and kind of a different, more bioavailable type of nutrient.
Do you lose any nutrient value if, like, you cook your beans and then you freeze portions and put them in the freezer?
Definitely not. Beans do freeze very well, and frozen is always second best to fresh. So, never turn your nose up at frozen fruits or vegetables. Definitely look for those without any additives, like we're talking about. If you're buying frozen green beans, you should only see green beans on your ingredients label. If you're buying frozen blueberries, you should just see blueberries. But at home too, if you want to blanch and then freeze a large amount of vegetables from your garden, that's absolutely fine. And if you have a huge pot of beans and you're freezing off the rest, always get as much air out of your bag or your container so you don't get the frostbite and just that flavor, that negative flavor piece. But no, you retain your nutrient value. You will lose some if you freeze and reheat and freeze and reheat, because then you're exposing to heat over and over and breaking down some of those nutrients. But just for the freezing process itself.
We do black beans just in a crock pot and then put them in like two cup freezing, freezing in 2 cup things. So then it's like, if you're doing burritos or if you're doing whatever, you can just grab one little frozen.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, you have your portions already cooked at the ready to incorporate into meals. Where's our beans? Yeah. And that is, of course, the better bet. Like we were saying, that is the better bet. When you do have the time, make a large batch, save the rest. The canned beans are great and convenient, but I haven't found a 0 sodium canned bean. There's some that you can get pretty darn close once you've drained and rinsed, but it's that preservation process that does require some sodium. The skinny on spices, so to speak, is be liberal with them. Any salt-free herb or spice, the more the merrier, literally. There's certain spices that have been touted to have stronger antioxidant properties. Turmeric is one of them. The curcumin in turmeric, the reason it's on this list, very powerful anti-inflammatory properties with that curcumin, and that's why it specifically is on the list. But any herbs and spices that you enjoy, use a heavy hand with them with cooking, and really try and get rid of the salt and throw in all of the spices and herbs that you enjoy. No limitations on spices and herbs added to meals. With whole grains, you'll see the serving size is quite small. It's 3 portions, but if you look at the portion sizes, it's just half a cup of, cooked hot cereal like the oats we keep talking about, or cooked grains. A small bowl of popcorn, 3 cups, 1 little tortilla or slice of bread, or a cup of the cold cereal. And I will say one thing about whole grains and cold cereals and diabetes. Be very cautious with cold cereals. 1 cup is not a whole lot. And most of the cold cereal companies, they set their servings at about 3/4 cup or sometimes a 1/2 cup. So be very cautious as far as your portions. And just the processed nature of cold cereals. It's quite difficult, unfortunately, to find a cold cereal, even the organic varieties and the whole grain varieties, that won't have negative outcomes with blood sugars after that meal. And then lastly, the beverages and the exercise. I'm sorry we ran out of time, but beverages, find a way to monitor your beverage intake throughout the day. The goal is 5 servings of 12 ounces. So again, those little cups are 8 ounces. It is true we want the 8 to 10 of those servings daily. But most of us are using about 12-ounce cups these days. And so we got to get at least 5 of those in a day. So 1 with each meal and then 2 more in between meals. And it's doable. It is doable. And yeah, if you're having trouble as far as doing a significant amount of fluid with meal, we don't want to be stretching your stomach and have your stomach get used to being overly full. So spread that fluid out. That's why it's nice to have a larger water bottle where you can kind of track how much you're taking in daily and just kind of sipping your fluid throughout the day and hitting that same hydration goal. And of course, we do want to keep them caffeine free, sugar free, and carbonation free to a certain extent, especially if we're dealing with people that are coming off of an overeating cycle, where we've really overstretched the stomach a lot. And last but not least, exercise. It's sad we have about 30 seconds to spend on exercise, but when it comes to diabetes prevention and management, a little bit does go a long way. And that's the other beautiful part of checking your blood sugars, is checking before and after even a short bout of exercise, even 10 minutes. Myself individually and people I've worked with, we do that test, and sometimes blood sugars can drop as much as 50 points in 10 minutes. And so we encourage people to trial, if their bodies are able to, trial exercise as an intervention to treat an elevated blood sugar. there's a range as far as when it's safe to use exercise this way and not. But to use that before reaching for the extra couple units of insulin. So it's kind of an alternative approach, but sometimes that can help people a lot if they're struggling, say, with those morning elevated blood sugars, is go out on a 10 or 15-minute walk, recheck, see where we're at before we dose the insulin accordingly.
I don't see any rice on this.
What's up?
Rice. No rice?
So rice is technically in your whole grains. We do want at least brown rice, if not wild rice. The unfortunate thing when it comes to prediabetes and diabetes, we still kind of struggle sometimes with rice and post-meal elevated blood sugars, even in small amounts, because it is very dense as far as the amount of starch per serving.
What are your thoughts on animal protein as a diabetic?
So animal protein, you'll see, is not on our daily dozen. And because our daily dozen focuses on fiber-rich, animal protein has no fiber. It focuses on anti-inflammatory foods. Animal protein, unfortunately, is pro-inflammatory. There's been a lot more research, especially in the past 10 years, as far as animal protein and diabetes. And one thing that's being found is they're seeing that fat, specifically animal fat, is having a much bigger impact on insulin resistance than was ever thought. And more of an impact on elevated blood sugars and insulin resistance than carbohydrate intake. So if you want to, to really dive into the research, it is kind of fun, but, you'll see there's a lot more out there that carbohydrates shouldn't be the sole focus and the sole enemy as far as, the cause and the progression of diabetes, but the high fat foods, specifically the high animal fat foods. And that's that whole concept. And the American Diabetes Association is onto some of this as far as the fat content. But the reason why, mono and polyunsaturated fats are more heavily encouraged, as far as avocado, whole foods are better. But olive oils, if we are using any olive oils, using small amounts of olive oils. That's why the nuts and the seeds are recommended versus, other forms of animal fats, the butter and, of course, naturally found fats in your animal protein, because they do set the stage for the inflammation, for the insulin resistance, and ultimately for the heart disease and the cancer piece. So, yeah, there's some scary research out there. I encourage you to go and seek it out and kind of digest it yourself as far as your thoughts there. I don't want to put thoughts in your mind with animal protein, but it is kind of scary, some of the research that's coming out, especially linking, all of our top 10 diseases here in America, their prevalence and the intake of animal protein that we're seeing in the U.S.
I'm kind of new to this, and I'm trying to come off dairy. So I was just wondering, I noticed there's no milk type substitutes. Okay, so my main concern is the idea of going from a fairly pure source of a milk to rice milk or almond milk, the things that I see that are fairly processed. And I don't really have time to make my own.
No, yeah, because ideally you make your own. There are some great organic varieties of plant-based milk, whether you prefer a flax milk, an almond milk. I use almond at home, an organic variety. The one thing to be a little cautious of with some of the plant milks is the added sodium. They can vary a lot from, less than 50 milligrams all the way up to almost 200 milligrams per 8 ounces. So be cautious there. They are fortified with calcium and vitamin D. They don't have to be. The good thing is when you're eating a plant-based diet, you do get adequate calcium and vitamin D from your whole foods. The plant-based milk, some people like that because they're getting the extra calcium and vitamin D that they felt they were missing from the animal-sourced milks. But yeah, you're lacking the saturated fat and the cholesterol, which is, the big heavy hitter as far as the diabetes management as well as the heart disease management. And there's a whole, again, this could be a whole nother talk, but there's, if you research, growth factors in milk, and we're talking even just your straight from the cow milk, there is kind of a growth factor that does, it's why baby cows grow so quickly and so beautifully, because the intake of that milk encourages growth. But they are starting to see some negative outcomes, especially with cancer and dairy intake because of that. I'll leave it at that. But if you guys are interested, there is a lot of really neat, research out there. And definitely just make sure that it's, of course, reputable sources that you're looking at online. We know the slippery slope with online researching.
Dory? With fish protein, I notice I immediately feel better within a minute of eating fish, and it sustains me for a very long time. As long as I don't start glowing in the dark because of the mercury. So, what would you say about fish and blood sugar?
So unfortunately, yeah, so all animal protein does have that same unfortunate, negative impact. However, specifically when we're talking about, and I'm trying to remember the specific components that are primarily cancer promoting, can't remember if they're called AGEs. Anyhow, they're the highest in chicken and in eggs. So if there's two big proteins to watch out for, dairy is one, chicken and eggs would be the second. But fish does still, any animal protein will have saturated fat, will have cholesterol, and can be pro-inflammatory. A lot of times people see, well, salmon, the fatty salmon has the omega-3 fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory. And so you may potentially be counteracting, some of the pro-inflammatory effect of the animal protein. It's kind of that same thing of, I want to have my omelet in the morning, I'm going to load up the vegetables with it. I would still say, if you're having the salmon every now and then, load up the vegetables, the beans with it. And it could very well be, part of a healthy diet. Because I myself, I am a plant-based eater, but there's times I'm out and about or I'm at a friend's house and I have a little cheese here and there. I don't do any meat, so to speak, any animal flesh. But from time to time, I will have a little dairy, and I will always tell people it's what you're doing 90% of the time. I do fall off the wagon, but I do also know these are the healthiest foods for me and for managing my own diabetes and my own health. And so I encourage you to do the same. We're not perfect. We want to set goals that are realistic. And so it may simply be, I'm not taking anything out of my current diet. I'm simply adding things in. And so picking a few things from this list to add in to the daily diet instead of focusing on taking things away. Everybody has, their body reacts differently, like Doreen says. She feels great if she has a little bit of salmon. And I would never tell, if you feel great after eating a certain food, and it's not a food that's as negative as a food that it's going to, cause something really bad to happen down the road. If you're having it every now and then and it's making you feel great, that's okay. And maybe the piece of chocolate, the little piece of chocolate you're having at night, if the rest, that 90% rule that you're doing is sticking, we're going to reap the health benefits. Type 2 diabetes starts at an A1C, this is kind of an average blood sugar percentage over time, of 6.5%. That's the start of type 2 diabetes. There are some organizations, like the American Diabetes Association, that likes to keep people below 7% if they've already been diagnosed. But there's some tighter organizations, like the endocrinologists, that like it a little bit tighter, below the 6.5, I believe. And as far as prediabetes, it starts at an A1C of 5.7. And so I definitely recommend if you have especially a family history of any type of diabetes, at the very least we need to do an annual fasting blood sugar. But I would go one step further, and if you've never had an A1C drawn, tack it on to your next lab draw. Because the A1C will look at an average of blood sugars over the past 90 days. And that was the only way I found out that I had prediabetes, because I had been educating people with diabetes, been playing around with meters, checking my blood sugar, and all of my spot checks were looking okay. But I was having some elevated blood sugars overnight and other times that I wasn't aware of. So it's a very simple test that I would encourage you to do and do annually.
Yeah, and if you're wheat sensitive, what are some other suggestions?
Good question. So those of you that have a true gluten allergy or intolerance, rice still is okay. Quinoa is okay. You can get gluten-free oats. Oats themselves don't contain wheat, but a lot of times they're contaminated with wheat through the growing process or processing in general in the mill. Other alternatives, not technically a starch, but the legumes, the lentils, the beans, green light ahead, corn, green light ahead. We want minimally processed corn. And so we do have to be cautious with corn and diabetes, but it can be used. There's some great sprouted grain and sprouted corn tortillas that can be purchased that we can incorporate into gluten-free and blood sugar-friendly meal planning. So we definitely, even if we're dealing with other dietary restrictions outside of the blood sugar world, we can make a meal plan work. It can get challenging at times, but we can make it work and still keep it whole food based. Dr. Greger, I just hold him near and dear to my heart. He wrote this book. This is the book on CD here, but How Not to Die. I know it's not the most uplifting title, but lots of great information in his book. He also has a website that's on your handout, nutritionfacts.org. There's a DVD and a whole line of books called Forks Over Knives that's very realistic as far as helping people on their journey towards whole food plant-based eating. So it's forksOverKnives.com, or just search Forks Over Knives. There's a variety of books. For those of you that want to get into more of kind of the research behind a lot of this, the China study you may have heard about, Dr. Joel Furman's book, Eat to Live, is another phenomenal one that's it has the kind of the best of both worlds. He has a meal plan and recipes at the end of the book, but then he talks about, a lot of kind of what's evolved, good, bad, and otherwise in the food industry, and our thoughts and recommendations and guidelines about food. Oh my gosh, there's a bunch. The Engine 2 Diet is another one. It's a nice free website and book. Another kind of educational site, it's called PCRM, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They have recipes, handouts, downloadable items there too. Dr. McDougall as well. Yeah, talk about just decades of research. He's been involved directly with a lot of the nutrition-based research that we're talking about tonight. Well, I thank everybody. I'm more than welcome to chat with you a little bit after if more questions are there. But thank you for your time, and thank you for your patience without our presentation tonight.